What would you do if you saw an elderly woman's bag ransacked in plain view and inside lay a neatly folded seal jacket, never before acknowledged by history? That one question fell silent across the entire checkpoint. Not out of fear, but because it stirred a chapter of American memory long buried. Who is that woman? And why do the medals on her jacket command a general to snap to attention and salute? Watch until the end. You may never look at our elders the same way again. If you believe silent service deserves recognition, hit subscribe. This story is for you. Her name was Margaret Duval, but everyone called her Maggie. 70 years old, living alone in Dayton, Ohio. On a gray morning in the heart of Washington, D.C., she stood in line outside the Hart Federal Building headquarters, a coarse canvas tote slung at her hip and a small rolling suitcase at her side. A light drizzle clung to the trim of her faded khaki coat like specks of time that refused to wash away. No one in line paid her any attention. Younger people tapped their phones, glanced impatiently at their watches, projecting the urgency of those who believe their presence is the day's most important appointment. Maggie, however, stood erect, eyes forward, neither hurried nor hesitant, as if she had awaited this moment her entire life, and now had nowhere else to rush. When her turn came, she stepped up to the security checkpoint and extended a worn ID card and an envelope bearing the clear seal of the 17th floor senior liaison office. The officer on duty, a man of about 30, with a practiced, stony expression, quickly reviewed the documents, then cast her a skeptical look he had perfected over years at the security desk. "Hold on," he said, signaling her to pause. His gaze did not linger on the invitation letter, but it settled on her tote. An elderly person's baggold, unbranded, with no combination lock, just a tarnished zipper and a few worn corners. "Please open the bag." Maggie nodded once, as if she had awaited that request. She placed her tote on the cold metal counter and carefully unzipped it. The soft zip sounded like tearing open a long-suppressed secret. Inside were simple items: a prescription pill bottle, a small wallet containing insurance cards, and a faded photo of a family of 4 in front of a wooden house, and a yellowed envelope tied with thin twine. And at one corner, neatly folded and pressed flat, lay a swatch of heavy, deep navy fabric, held in place by 2 gleaming brass pins. Maggie said nothing, quietly watching the officer rifling through her bag. When he reached for the navy cloth, she inched forward just slightly. Not to stop him, simply a reflex, as if her hand had long protected it. He lifted the fabric and unfolded it before everyone. Under the harsh fluorescent light, it revealed itself as part of a jacket meticulously stitched trim, heavy navy wool. But it was the embellishments that shifted the room's atmosphere. 3 insignia. First, the familiar seal tridenta skull wearing a helmet, crossed rifle and anchor, and outstretched wings. Second, a ribbon bearing 3 tarnished silver stars. Third, hand-embroidered text. Team 2, Operation Wind Crest. The officer stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the jacket, brow furrowed, lips pressed tight. Not because he fully understood what he saw, but because he sensed something extraordinary had been revealed. He slowly turned to Maggie. His gaze still held skepticism, but now laced with astonishment and confusion. For a fleeting moment, he must have wondered, could this be real? Maggie did not look back. She stared at the jacket. Her face showed no clear emotion, yet her eyes held a depth of something lost, buried, and never spoken. A faint mist seemed to hover around her expression, as though she alone recognized what lay before her. Around them, the checkpoint buzzed. But in that moment, every breath seemed to slow, a confrontation neither loud nor physical but unmistakably unfolding. Not between an old woman and a security officer, but between the past and its erasure, between a secret hidden and those unwilling to look beneath the faded cloth. While everyone else gaped, the elderly woman stood still as if her whole life had prepared her for exactly this moment. The jacket lay silently on the metal table, unfurled like an unexpected doorway into an era no one believed someone like her could ever enter. Its navy fabric had faded over the years, yet the stitching remained firm and crisp as the day it was sewn. On the left breast, the raised seal emblem stood out, a skull wearing a steel helmet, a crossed rifle and anchor, and outstretched wings. That insignia was never meant for collectors. It belonged only to those who had endured hell and returned. Below it were 3 hand-stitched ribbons: Beirut 83, Panama 89, and Wind Crestige, a scar etched onto America's military memory. These are not names in school textbooks, but for those who survived, they mark seismic events. Beirut, 1983, where a bombing at the Marine barracks killed over 200 servicemen. Panama, 1989, Operation Just Cause, much of which remains scrubbed from public records. And Wind Cresno, one knows what that was. A silent name, like a secret never told. The young officer still stood motionless, his arm rigid. He had no words for this. He only felt that something profound was overriding his initial skepticism. Then another man approached, an older security guard, sun-leathered skin, salt and pepper hair, name tag reading Chavez. Chavez said nothing for a few seconds. He simply studied the jacket, moving in slowly as if approaching something sacred. He bent over, his fingers lightly brushing each ribbon, each cloth patch, each tiny badge. "This is no replica," he said, his voice hoarse yet certain. The young officer glanced at him, his face waiting for more. "Beirut 83, Chavez repeated. "I was stationed in Bahrain with a quick reaction unit. We lost an entire platoon that night. But this name," he pointed at the Wind Crest ribbon, "I only ever heard once, from an intelligence officer who disappeared immediately afterward." The atmosphere at the checkpoint felt compressed, a strange hush settling over the crowd. Those in line began to pay attention. A few pulled out their phones not to capture a story, but because they sensed something important unfolding, a facade shattered, a secret suddenly revealed. A young man in a hoodie whispered to his friend, "Is she for real?" His friend nodded, eyes fixed on the scene. No one can fake eyes like that. The younger officer, having lowered his weapon, stepped back half a pace. Yet his gaze remained locked on the jacket, as if trying to fathom why he, trained in every security protocol, could not categorize what stood before him. Because some symbols cannot be forged, not merely for their craftsmanship or detail, but for the weight they carry: history, blood, and decades of silence. A lone woman stood by the table, asking for no recognition, uttering no word. Yet the entire checkpoint, the gathering crowd, felt one thing: she did not belong here, where everyone's bag is treated as a potential threat. She belonged to those places where a woman's very presence on the front lines went unrecorded. And for that reason, no one believed she could truly exist. But then they began to believe. Not because of the jacket, nor the insignia alone, but because of something no one can imitate: the quiet steadiness in her eyes, the eyes of someone who had lived through what no one else dared to remember. No one noticed when a trio entered the lobby by the side entrance, 2 plainclothes bodyguards and a man in a general's uniform. Yet it was his gaze that shifted the atmosphere. General Benjamin Carr, commander of the D.C. Joint Task Force, had served 3 decades, renowned for his firmness and discretion. He rarely appeared at security checkpoints. Rarer still was the moment he halted mid-hallway when his eyes fell upon something familiar. It was not a persona, it was the jacket. He stepped forward 2 paces, his eyes slowly scanning each insignia, each stitch. And when they rested on the embroidered name over the breast pocket, Duval, MSEL Team 2, he straightened, withdrew his hand from his pocket, and without warning snapped a military salute. "Former Petty Officer Duval," he said, his voice deep, clear, without hesitation. No one in the room stirred. The young officer beside the jacket, the same one who had earlier doubted and questioned her, stood frozen, as though struck by that single phrase. They had rifled through her bag. They had sifted through her past, but none had recognized the identity of the woman standing silently before them. Maggie did not look up immediately. She paused for half a seconda, slow moment, then lifted her head and met the man's eyes. No surprise, no emotion. Only the mutual acknowledgement between two people who knew each other well enough to need no introduction. "General Carr," she said, slowly but loudly enough for all to hear. "It's been a long time." "Far too long," he nodded, his expression softening. "We've been waiting for you upstairs." No further protocol followed. A single nod, then another officer stepped forward, motioning for Maggie to proceed. The young guard hastily stepped back, allowing her to pass with her bag now closed. Yet his eyes never left her, not in suspicion, but in confusion, as though clinging to a lesson learned too late. Maggie walked slowly but surely. Each step seemed to cut through an invisible layer of prejudice against age, against gender, against what history records and what it ignores. Behind her, those in line stood in silence. A few lowered their phones, no longer feeling a need to record. What they had just witnessed was no longer a scene, but something sacred, an elderly woman reclaimed from obscurity, a piece of history finally named. No one in that crowd knew the full story. Yet each felt deep in their chest that they had crossed the boundary between what is seen and what must be understood. Upstairs, the conference room was prepared for a simple yet solemn ceremony. The Navy Distinguished Service Medallion of the highest honors for exceptional military service rested on a purple velvet cushion beside a nameplate reading Margaret A.D. Uval. That name had never appeared in any public record. Because her missions rescuing hostages in Beirut, thwarting sabotage in the Panama Canal, and a covert operation known only as Wind Crest had all been sealed in classified files, never to be acknowledged. Until today, the files were declassified just last month, and those who had lived in silence behind walls of denial were finally named. Maggie was among the few survivors and the only woman in her unit to have commanded a team in what remains a mostly male formation the military still quietly avoids mentioning. General Carr knew this. He knew every layer of classification, every terse briefing where Duval appeared only as a ghostly rumor and internal legend, never permitted in public discourse. And now he stood just inside the open door, not to bestow honor, but to witness a long overdue correction, not for government prestige, but because people like her deserve to be seen, to be named. Down in the hallway, her old canvas bag still bore raindrops on its strap. And on that jacket, the unforgeable insignia had finally found its rightful home. Dear viewers, take a moment to relax or grab a drink, then continue listening. More surprises lie ahead. Comment 1 if you found this story moving, so we know you're still with us. That afternoon, sunlight filtered through the soaring glass windows of Capitol View's great hall, casting golden beams along the marble floor. The chamber did not feel festive. It was hushed and solemn, as if the very building itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Beneath flags hanging vertically from the ceiling, invited guests sat upright in velvet-covered chairs. Some were senior military officers, others high-ranking government officials, and among them, a small group of elders. They wore no uniforms, but on each left lapel was a small token, a lapel pin, a silver badge, a faded ribbon. They were the survivors of a nameless campaign that now, at last, was seeing its first lines written into history. The President of the United States stepped to the podium, not with fanfare but with steady, deliberate steps. His brief address was understated. Today, we recognize those whose names once did not exist. They lived, served, and sacrificed in silence, not for fame, but for a safer America. Then the first name was called. Then the second. When the announcer intoned, "Margaret A.D., Yuval, former petty officer, SEAL Team 2 Operation Windcrest," a soft murmur rippled through the hall. Those who had heard her story at the security checkpoint stood frozen. The rest simply watched an elderly woman rise and walk steadily to the stage, her silver hair and erect posture as resolute as a drawn sword. She wore no uniform, but her eyes carried history. The president waited as she approached, then bowed his head to pin the Navy Distinguished Service Medallion of the nation's highest military honor onto her chest. He spoke no further, neither did she. Between them passed a single nod, not of power, but of recognition. No thunderous applause followed, no cheers, only the hush that filled the chamber, not from lack of feeling, but because emotion had transcended words. It was reverence and, for some, shame. Maggie stood there, her right hand resting lightly on the fabric where the medal had been pinned. She said nothing. She smiled not. Yet something in her eyes had shifted, as if a door within her had softly closed at last. Below, General Carr gave a slight nod. He knew what it meant. Not honor in being named, but homecoming. After all those years, Maggie was finally seen not as evidence pulled from an old tote, but as a part of history the country owed her recognition. The ceremony continued. Medals were awarded, hands were shaken, yet most eyes in the room remained on the elderly woman seated quietly in the front row with her new medal resting against an old heart. She held no phone, filmed nothing, posted nothing online. She simply sat, hands folded in her lap, as though embracing something no one else could touch. The years of anonymity, the missions without memoirs, the fallen comrades. She did not cry. But those who understand would know. Within her silence was folded a grief and a glory restored by that silence. Behind her, on the marble wall of the great hall, shone a bronze inscription. For those who served without being seen. For those who served without being seen. And today, Maggie Duval, at last, was seen. The ceremony ended, and the hall slowly emptied. Handshakes dwindled, congratulations softened like waves receding after high tide. Officers, reporters, and guests began to drift into the corridors, their shoes whispering against the stone floor in a faint, indistinct soundtrack. In a corner, Maggie stood alone. She did not join the post-ceremony tea, nor accept any interview requests. She simply stood motionless, her arms gently cradling the returned canvas tote, which now held not just her old belongings, but also a gleaming medal. Late afternoon light flooded through the windows, illuminating her deeply lined face. Yet in her eyes there was neither pride nor anger, only the calm of someone who had just folded away a chapter of her life, needing no one's understanding, only permission to be acknowledged. A soft voice spoke from behind, tentative and almost shy. "Ma'am." Maggie turned. Before her stood a young woman, her security uniform now replaced by a gray blouse and simple jeans. Her brown hair was tied back, and her eyes carried an earnest hesitation. She must have been in her early 20s, the same officer who had conducted the screening earlier. "My name is Layla," she stammered, eyes downcast. "I was on duty when it happened." Maggie said nothing, merely nodded once, inviting her to continue. "I just want to apologize," Layla went on, glancing at the floor, "not because I conducted the search, but because I stayed silent." A hush fell. Maggie looked at the young woman before her without anger, without suspicion, only a composed gaze, as though she had witnessed this countless times before. Layla looked up, summoning all her courage. "How did you maintain your dignity when you were stared at like that? When you were suspected? When your bag was searched?" Maggie slowly turned her gaze toward the window, where trees shimmered in the late light. Then she faced Layla again, her voice low but clear. "Because holding on to your dignity means they cannot take you from yourself." Layla froze. She blinked, as if still not fully understanding. Maggie continued, needing no further prompt. Dignity does not lie in how others treat you. It lies in your choice not to let their actions erase who you are. The young officer fell silent. Something inside her began to shatter her innocence, her trust in authority, and the shame of realizing she had once stayed silent in the face of wrongdoing. Is it, Layla hesitated, that as we grow older, we learn to endure it more? Maggie shook her head slowly. No, dear, we never truly get used to being judged, but over time we learn not to let others' eyes define us. Layla studied the woman before her silver-haired, with a steady voice and hands worn yet resolute, and realized that, perhaps for the first time, she was hearing a lesson no classroom, supervisor, or employee manual had ever taught her. Thank you, Layla whispered, not just for what you did, but for what you are still teaching. Maggie laid a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture not of power, but of passing on understanding. Not everyone hears, but if you are listening, then that is enough. Layla nodded, her eyes bright not with sadness, but with the revelation of seeing herself in a woman she once thought a stranger. And perhaps, for the first time in her career, she understood the true meaning of service, not just enforcing security, but protecting human dignity even when the system forgets it. Before leaving the Capitol View building, Maggie paused in the ground floor hallway. There this morning she had stood under scrutinizing eyes, amid curt orders and harsh fluorescent light. Now the space was hushed, as though exhaling a long-suppressed truth. Rustin and Lorette were waiting there. Not by regulation, but because something in their hearts compelled them to stay. The two security officers who had doubted and inspected her at dawn now stood motionless, their trained confidence replaced by something more honest, confusion, and a measure of remorse. Maggie approached them without flinching. They did not speak at once. Finally, Rustin broke the silence, his tone devoid of command. "Ma'am, we'd like to apologize." She did not react immediately. She simply looked at them, then nodded once, a nod neither condemning nor forgiving, but simply acknowledging. Then she spoke, her voice low, each word clear. "The greatest wrong was not what you did." She paused, letting the silence settle around them. "But what you failed to see." Her words fell into the space like a drop of water on glass, quiet, yet reverberating. Rustin bowed his head, while Lorette stood tall but with altered eyes. Neither argued nor excused themselves. They understood that it wasn't the search that had hurt her, but their unwillingness to look deeply at the person before them. They had seen only a potential threat, not a human being. In that brief moment, a lesson was passed on not through books, but through the quiet presence of a woman who had survived far worse many times over. As Maggie turned away, the two men remained standing, something within them continuing to shift, slowly but irreversibly. Outside, the sky had cleared. The pale pink of late afternoon washed over stone walls and reflected in the tall glass panes of the government building. No more rain, no more dampness. Only the calm relief after a storm had passed. Maggie walked slowly beside Layla, the young officer who had caught up to her, still keeping a respectful distance, but whose expression had softened. No longer the wary look of that morning, but eyes seeking something beyond rank, a sense of direction. "May I ask you one last question?" Layla said, her voice as soft as a breeze. Maggie turned and nodded. "Why do you serve?" A simple question, but one Maggie had likely pondered all day. And all her life. Maggie stopped. Looking straight toward the light at the end of the corridor, she smiled, not the smile of someone just honored, but of someone finally unburdened after carrying too long a weight. "Because sometimes," she said, her voice husky yet steady, "serving is the only thing that keeps you human." Layla did not reply in words, but her face had changed. Something within her had been set in place. Two walked out together, one old, one young, from the building where truth had once been hidden and had just been revealed. When the doors closed behind them, it seemed the story had ended. Yet in the viewers' hearts remained a silent echo-like, the distant echo of words never spoken, of people who served and went unnoticed, of forgetting that often springs not from malice, but from thoughtlessness, and of what we so often lose amid life's busyness, respect for one another. Perhaps what moves us most is not the medal, nor the title, but the proud silence of someone once deemed invisible who still retains her dignity. This lesson is not only for security officers, it is for all of us living in a hurried, judgmental society that too often forgets that behind every face, every measured step, may lie a story never told. Maggie needs no further honor. But the world needs to learn to remember what it has forgotten. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If it touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments, and if you know someone who has served, send this video to them. We would love to know your city and the time you're viewing this video so we know that somewhere in America, people still care about human dignity. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more stories like this. Truth when told right can heal.